Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are journeying back to a time when a sneeze wasn't just a sneeze, and a cough was a potential final goodbye. We're going to dim the lights on your cosy modern bedroom and step into a world where life was short, brutal, and often cut even shorter by the cruel hand of disease. A world where medical knowledge was, well, let's just say, creatively lacking. You probably won't survive this. In fact, if you were to somehow materialise in the middle of a bustling 14th century street, you'd have a better chance of winning the lottery than dodging the myriad of microscopic, medieval menaces lurking in every shadow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You can also drop a comment below with your location and local time, and let's see just how far this little historical time machine can reach tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. All right, settle in. Picture yourself, if you can, standing on a bustling European dockside in the mid-13th century. The air is thick with the briny smell of the sea mixed with the less pleasant odours of human waste, rotting fish, and general squalor. You can hear the cacophony of a dozen different languages, the shouts of sailors, the creaking of masts, and the flutter of countless seagulls. A ship has just arrived, its sails tattered from a long journey across the Mediterranean. This is it. This is your first encounter with the most famous and infamous guest of the Middle Ages. You see the sailors disembarking, but something is off. They look sick, disoriented. Some have strange swollen lumps in their armpits and groins, the colour of a bruised plum. These are the buboes, and you, my friend, are about to witness the dawn of the Black Death. This wasn't just a disease. It was an apocalyptic event. It was a silent, creeping terror that arrived without warning, and spread with a speed that defied all logic to the terrified people of the time. The sheer suddenness of it was what made it so terrifying. One day you might be feeling fine, maybe a little headache, and by nightfall you were struck down with a high fever and chills. Within days, your body would be covered in black blotches from internal bleeding, the telltale sign that the end was near. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? To go from vibrant health to the brink of death in the span of a single weekend. It's hard to imagine in our age of antibiotics and vaccines, but this was the reality for a third of Europe's population. The plague's journey was like a slow-moving but relentless wave. It's believed to have originated in Central Asia, perhaps somewhere in the Gobi Desert, and then, via the Silk Road, it hitchhiked its way to Europe. But it wasn't carried by people alone. It was the humble black rat, along with its flea passengers, that was the primary vector. These weren't your average city rats, mind you. These were rats of a different calibre, a sort of four-legged Trojan horse. The fleas would bite an infected rat, drink its blood, and then, when the rat died, they'd look for a new host. Enter you, the unlucky medieval citizen. The flea would jump onto you, bite you, and in doing so, regurgitate the Yersinia pestis bacteria into your bloodstream, and just like that, the clock started ticking. Now, let's talk about the symptoms. This is where it gets truly gruesome. You, a healthy individual, would first start to feel a terrible headache, followed by nausea and dizziness. You might try to lie down, but the fever would set in, so hot it felt like your skin was on fire. Your lymph nodes, particularly those in your groin, armpits and neck, would begin to swell. These were the buboes, the signature of the bubonic plague. They could grow to the size of an orange, and they were excruciatingly painful. The body, unable to fight off the overwhelming infection, would start to break down. Subcutaneous hemorrhages, or internal bleeding just beneath the skin, would cause the black blotches that gave the plague its grim name. Historians still argue whether the term Black Death referred to these blotches or to the dark, sombre mood of the era itself. Either way, it paints a pretty dark picture. The spread was so rapid that it challenged the very fabric of society. Villages were wiped out completely in a matter of weeks. The dead were so numerous that there was no time for proper burials. Mass graves, some of which are still being uncovered today, became the grim solution. Priests and doctors, who you'd expect to be the pillars of society in a crisis, were often the first to fall because they were in direct contact with the sick. The lack of understanding about contagion meant that people would visit their sick family members or attend a dying friend's bedside, unknowingly sealing their own fate. There were no masks, no sanitizers, and certainly no idea that a tiny, nearly invisible creature was the culprit. And it wasn't just the bubonic plague, there was also a pneumonic form which was even more deadly. This type of plague attacked the lungs and was spread through the air, a cough, a sneeze, even a breath. You'd be standing in a crowd and someone would cough, a little spray of moisture would land on your face and that would be it. Within a day, you would be coughing up blood and your lungs would fill with fluid. This version was almost always fatal, and its ability to jump from person to person without the need for a flea made it a terrifyingly efficient killer. The fact that the same disease could manifest in two distinct and equally lethal ways was a grim quirk of nature. It was like a game of Russian roulette, but with a dozen more bullets in the chamber. As the death toll mounted, a widespread panic set in. Some people believed it was a punishment from God, a divine scourge for humanity's sins. Processions of flagellants, groups of men who would publicly whip themselves to atone for their sins and, they hoped, for the sins of the world, became a common sight. They would move from town to town, their backs a bloody mess, preaching repentance. It was a bizarre and gruesome spectacle, a testament to the desperate lengths people would go to in the face of an incomprehensible horror. Others, in a more hedonistic turn, decided that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well live it up. They'd drink, feast and engage in all sorts of debauchery, believing that their fate was sealed regardless of their actions. The Black Death was a great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a peasant in the fields or a nobleman in a castle. The plague didn't care about your social status. While the wealthy might have had a slightly better chance of escaping a crowded city, if the plague found you, it found you. It was a brutal reminder of human fragility and the chaos that a single microscopic organism could unleash on a global scale. The sheer scale of the mortality rate is what sets it apart from other diseases. We're talking about a quarter to a half of the population in some regions. Imagine your town losing half its residents in a single year. The silence that would descend on the streets, the empty homes, the sheer, unadulterated grief. It's almost impossible to truly grasp. One of the more quirky tidbits from this era is the belief in a miasma, or a bad smell, as the cause of disease. People thought that the plague was carried on This led to people carrying sweet-smelling flowers and herbs, or burning aromatic woods. You might even find someone walking around with a little pomander, a small perforated container filled with a mixture of fragrant herbs. While it did nothing to stop the plague, at least the streets smelled a little better. It was a charming, if completely useless, coping mechanism in the face of a terrifyingly invisible enemy. As the first wave of the plague eventually subsided, it left a changed world in its wake. There were labour shortages, a breakdown of feudal systems, and a complete re-evaluation of society's power structures. But as we tuck this first section away for the night, remember that the Black Death wasn't a one-and-done event. It would return, again and again, in smaller but still deadly waves for centuries. Its shadow, and the memory of its gruesome arrival, would forever linger over the medieval psyche. So you see, our journey has only just begun. The plague has set the stage, but there are countless other diseases, each with its own brand of agony waiting for us to discover. All right, let's keep going. Our journey into the grim realities of medieval medicine has only just begun. Remember those terrified dock workers watching the sick sailors disembark? Well, as the plague began its rampage through Europe, a new, almost fantastical figure emerged from the chaos. You, the terrified townsfolk, would eventually hear stories of these shadowy, beak-masked figures cloaked in heavy waxen leather. They were the plague doctors. They weren't real doctors in the sense you or I would understand it, but rather municipal employees hired by towns and cities to count the dead and offer what they could in the way of cures. They were the first responders of the apocalypse, and their uniform was the stuff of nightmares. Imagine this, a tall leather coat that looked like something a butcher might wear, covering you from head to toe. Leather gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the ensemble. But the most iconic part was the mask. It was a terrifying creation, a grotesque leather beak-like snout filled with a concoction of aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices, things like mint, camphor, myrrh, or cloves. The idea, remember, was that disease was carried by foul odours, so if you could surround yourself with a powerful, pleasing scent, you might be safe. The eye holes were covered with glass. It was meant to be a full-body hazmat suit, a sort of medieval PPE. a sight so unsettling that it could make a grown man faint on the spot. The doctor's tools were just as peculiar as their outfits. They carried a long wooden stick or cane, which had a few different uses. First, it was for keeping a safe distance from the patient. No touching, thank you very much. They could prod, poke, and turn over the sick without getting too close. Second, they used it to point out what to do to the patient's family. And finally, they used it to shoo away anyone who got too close to them. Can you blame them? It was a job with a nearly 100% chance of a terrible outcome, and the pay wasn't even that great. The doctors, or medici as they were known, were often second-rate physicians who couldn't find work otherwise, or simply men with no medical training at all who saw a chance for a quick coin. Now, let's talk about the cures. This is where things get truly creative and frankly quite grim. The prevailing medical theory of the time was the theory of the four humours. You probably remember this from your school days. The belief was that the human body was made up of four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A person was healthy when these humours were in perfect balance, but if one of them was out of whack, you'd get sick. The plague, they reasoned, was caused by an excess of black bile. The logical solution, of course, was to get rid of the excess bile. How? Well, you'll love this. The most common cure was bloodletting. The plague doctor would make a small incision in a vein, or, even more commonly, apply leeches to the patient's skin. The idea was to literally bleed the sickness out of the body. You, as the patient, would be bled a little at a time, and sometimes you'd be bled until you fainted from blood loss. It was a practice that was as popular as it was dangerous, and it was used for everything from a fever to a headache. In a time when a patient was already weakened by fever, bloodletting only made things worse. It was a real case of the cure being arguably worse than the disease itself. Historians still argue whether this practice was born of pure ignorance, or was a desperate act of faith in a world with no other options. But that was just the beginning of the bizarre treatments. Remember those painful, swollen buboes we talked about? The plague doctors had a special way of dealing with them. They'd cut them open. Oh, yes. With a knife or razor, they would slice into the swollen lymph node, a procedure that must have been excruciatingly painful without anaesthesia. Then, they'd apply a paste or poultice. These poultices were a strange mix of things, often containing substances you really wouldn't want on an open wound. You might have a poultice made of boiled onions, figs, yeast and butter. Or, in a more eyebrow-raising concoction, you might get a poultice made from the patient's own waste. Yes, you heard that right. It was believed that the patient's bodily fluids could be used to combat the disease, a grim form of self-medication. Another popular remedy was the unicorn horn. This wasn't a real unicorn horn, of course, as they don't exist, but rather the tusk of a narwhal. It was believed to have magical properties and was ground into a powder and sold at exorbitant prices to the elite. A pinch of unicorn horn powder in your water was a surefire way to ward off the plague, at least according to the charlatans who sold it. And then there was the famous theriac, a complex concoction with dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper's flesh. It was believed to be a universal antidote for all poisons and diseases. It was a bit like a medieval multivitamin, if your multivitamin also contained ground-up snakes. The placebo effect, or perhaps the opium, might have made people feel a little better, but it did nothing to stop the plague. The clergy and the religious community had their own set of ideas. They would preach that the plague was a punishment from God, and the only cure was prayer and penance. People would flock to churches praying for salvation, and in doing so they'd pack themselves into small enclosed spaces, a perfect breeding ground for the pneumonic plague. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The very thing they thought would save them was in fact accelerating their demise. It's a testament to how deeply the terror had taken hold that people would turn to faith even when it seemed to lead them directly into the path of death. One of the more peculiar and gruesome tidbits from the time was the use of mummified crocodile dung as a cure. Yes, you heard me right. It was believed that the properties of the dried dung could somehow draw out the illness. Imagine a plague doctor in his full leather get-up handing you a small pouch of mummified crocodile dung, with a wink and a nod, as if to say, "Don't worry, this will make you feel better." It's a hilarious image, but for the poor soul who was desperate enough to try it, it was a testament to their hopelessness. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, the one that probably wasn't a thing? This one definitely was. It was a grim example of the blind desperation that gripped the world, So, while the plague doctor's outfit may be a popular costume today, it was a terrifying symbol of a medical system that was completely and utterly helpless against the invisible enemy. Their cures were based on a misunderstanding of the human body, an abundance of superstition, and a whole lot of magical thinking. It was a time when the line between a doctor and a charlatan was incredibly thin, and a person's life was more in the hands of fate than it was in the hands of their physician. And yet these men bravely walked into a sea of sickness and death, not for a promise of a better life, but for a promise of, well, a little bit of money and maybe a slightly better than average chance of surviving the week. The plague was a wake-up call, but it would take centuries for people to truly understand the nature of disease. The medieval world, however, was about to face many more afflictions, each with its own grotesque symptoms and futile remedies. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, be grateful for modern medicine, for clean water, for antibiotics, and for the fact that no one is going to recommend you drink a potion made from ground-up animal parts. The plague doctor's beak-like mask and peculiar cures are a chilling reminder of a world that didn't know what it didn't know, a world that we've only just begun to explore. We'll be moving on from the plague now, but its shadow and the lessons it taught will follow us for the rest of our journey. All right, let's leave the chaotic, plague-ridden docks behind and trudge on. As you walk the cobblestone streets, you might notice a figure on the edge of town, ringing a bell or clacking a wooden clapper. The sound is a slow, rhythmic clack, 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 a haunting sound meant to warn you to keep your distance. This is your first encounter with leprosy, and the poor soul making that sound is a leper, an outcast forced to live a lonely existence on the fringes of society. It was in many ways a fate worse than death. The plague was swift and brutal. Leprosy was a slow, agonizing, public spectacle of a decline. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease as we know it today, is a chronic bacterial infection. But in the Middle Ages the cause was unknown, and the visible symptoms made it a source of profound fear and superstition. You can't hide from it. It's a disease that slowly and visibly disfigured its victims. The first sign might be a pale patch of skin, or a small, painless nodule. You'd think nothing of it at first, but then, as the disease progressed, the facial features would begin to change. The skin would thicken and fold, especially around the eyebrows and forehead, giving a lion-like appearance. The nose might collapse, the ears might thicken. It was a slow erasure of the face you knew, a horrifying transformation. But the real cruelty of leprosy wasn't just the disfigurement, it was the loss of sensation. The bacteria attacks the nerves, and as a result your ability to feel pain, heat, or cold would gradually disappear. This sounds like a superpower, doesn't it? The ability to feel no pain. But it's a terrifying liability. You could burn your hand on a fire and not know it. A small cut on your foot could go unnoticed, become infected, and turn into a chronic weeping ulcer. Because you couldn't feel anything, injuries would go untreated, leading to secondary infections and eventually the loss of fingers, toes, and limbs. You would literally fall apart piece by piece, a walking monument to a disease that robbed you of the very sense that protects you from harm. The social ramifications of leprosy were just as brutal as the physical ones. In a deeply religious society, the disease was often seen as a punishment from God for a person's sins. It was a public mark of moral corruption, a physical sign that you were unclean and unworthy. This belief led to the creation of leper colonies, also known as lazarets. These were isolated communities, often far from the main towns, where lepers were sent to live out their days. It was a formal, public banishment. A person diagnosed with leprosy would be given a final funeral service while they were still alive, symbolising their death to the world. They were given a special garment to wear and that distinctive wooden clapper to announce their presence and to warn people to stay away. And this wasn't just a grim anecdote, it was a mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, there were an estimated 19,000 leper houses across Europe. Can you imagine? The sight of a leper was so common that it became part of the daily landscape. You would hear their bell, and you would step off the path, avert your eyes, and pretend they weren't there. It was a world that made a public spectacle of the sick, and in doing so stripped them of their dignity and humanity. You weren't a person with an illness. You were an illness that used to be a person. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolation of lepers was motivated by a genuine fear of contagion, or simply a moral and religious aversion to the physically unclean. Probably a bit of both. One of the quirkier tidbits about this period is that some people believe that a person with leprosy could be cured by bathing in the blood of a child. It's a stomach-turning thought, a testament to the sheer desperation that gripped the minds of people who saw no other option. This fringe belief, thankfully, was not widespread, but it was a horrifying example of the kind of folklore and dark superstition that flourished in the face of a terrifying, incurable disease. The fear of leprosy was so widespread that there were even accusations of lepers being in a conspiracy to poison wells and infect the general population. In the early 14th century, there was a mass arrest and burning of lepers in France and other parts of Europe, based on a rumour that they were working with Muslims and Jews to spread the disease. It was a grotesque and tragic example of a vulnerable group being scapegoated in a time of widespread paranoia. This was a dark period in human history, a reminder of how fear can twist people's minds and lead to unimaginable cruelty. Even if you weren't an outcast, you might still face a grim diagnosis. Physicians of the time, operating under the theory of the four humours, believed that leprosy was caused by an excess of black bile. The recommended treatment, naturally, was to try to restore the balance. This meant more bloodletting, a diet of cold and moist foods to counteract the heat of the disease, and the use of strange herbal remedies. None of it worked, of course. The disease, once it took hold, was a slow, methodical march toward complete physical breakdown. There were no antibiotics, no way to stop the relentless march of the bacteria. The living conditions in the leper colonies were often a mix of neglect and a sort of bleak communal living. People would share their final days with others who were in a similar state of physical and emotional ruin. Sometimes a patron or a religious order would provide for them, but more often than not they were left to fend for themselves, relying on the pity and charity of the outside world. It was a life lived in the shadows, a slow fade to black. You would watch yourself decay, day by day, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it. It was a public, physical, and psychological torment. As we move on from the sight of the lonely leper, remember that not all diseases were as visually dramatic as leprosy. Some were silent killers, striking quickly and without warning. But the very public nature of leprosy, the way it marked its victims for all to see, left a deep scar on the medieval psyche. It was a chilling reminder that your body could betray you, and that the society you lived in could turn its back on you in an instant. The sound of that clapper, the sight of a disfigured face, was a stark reminder of the fragile line between a normal life and a living death. Let's keep moving. You've seen the plague's furious speed and the agonizing slow decay of leprosy. Now, imagine a disease that combines the terror of the first with the speed of a lightning strike, a sickness that would strike without warning and dispatch its victim in a matter of hours. We're talking about the Great Sweating Sickness, also known as the English Sweat. This was a truly mysterious and terrifying affliction that appeared in England and nowhere else, in 5 distinct outbreaks between 1485 and 1551. It was as if the island itself had its own personal invisible Grim Reaper, striking down its inhabitants at random. The first thing to know about the sweating sickness is that it was fast. You might be feeling perfectly well at breakfast, and by lunch you would feel a sudden, terrifying sense of dread, followed by a violent shivering fit. The shivers would be so intense that your whole body would convulse. Then, almost as quickly as it began, the shivering would stop, and an unbearable, all-consuming heat would take over. You would be consumed by an overwhelming thirst and a debilitating headache. But the most prominent symptom, the one that gave the disease its name, was the sweat. This wasn't just a regular sweat from a fever. This was a profuse, cold, and foul-smelling sweat that would drench you from head to toe. Your clothes, your bedding, everything would be soaked. The illness would progress so quickly that a person could go from being completely healthy to being in the throes of death in just a few hours. The window of opportunity to survive was incredibly small, often just a single day. People who went to bed feeling fine were often found dead in the morning. This unpredictable and rapid onset meant that people lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing if their next shiver would be the start of their final, sweaty hours. The baffling thing about the sweating sickness was that it was a total mystery. No one knew what caused it, how it spread, or where it came from. The prevailing theory was, you guessed it, a miasma, a bad odour. The disease seemed to strike anyone, regardless of their social standing. Unlike the plague, which often hit the poor in crowded slums the hardest, the English sweat seemed to have a particular fondness for the wealthy and the well-fed. It would often strike down entire households of the nobility, leaving a trail of high-born corpses in its wake. This was a true historical fact that both puzzled and terrified the people of the time. The rich were no safer than the poor. It was a terrifying, democratic disease. The treatments for the sweating sickness were, as you might expect, a series of educated guesses. The doctors of the time, operating under the assumption of a miasma, would try to purify the air around the patient. They would burn fragrant woods, herbs and spices. They would also try to induce more sweating, believing that if they could get the bad humours out of the body through sweat, the patient would recover. This led to a very counterintuitive and dangerous cure. If you were sick, you were wrapped in blankets, forced to lie near a fire, and given warm drinks to encourage you to sweat more. This practice, of course, would only exacerbate the patient's fever and dehydration, pushing them closer to the brink of death. One of the more quirky tidbits is that some people believed that the disease was caused by a curse or by the stars. Since it was so fast and so indiscriminate, it was easy to fall into a state of magical thinking. People would wear strange amulets, say specific prayers, and seek out fortune tellers to try and avoid it. The medical community was just as clueless. They couldn't explain it, and their helplessness only fueled the superstition. The Great Sweating Sickness was a textbook example of a disease that completely baffled a society with no knowledge of microbiology. The first outbreak in 1485 was particularly brutal. It came right after the Battle of Bosworth Field, and it decimated the court of the new king Henry VII. He was just trying to get his new kingdom in order, and this mysterious disease swooped in and killed his Lord Mayor of London and 6 aldermen in a matter of days. It was a grim welcome to the throne. The disease would disappear for a few years, and then reappear with a terrifying vengeance, each time striking with the same speed and lethality. The way it behaved was completely different from the plague. The plague would linger in a town for months, a slow, continuous wave of death. The sweating sickness was a flash flood. It would hit a town, kill a significant number of people in a matter of days or weeks, and then vanish just as quickly as it had appeared. This led to a lot of confusion and a deep, ingrained fear. If you heard a rumour that the sweat was in a nearby village, you would immediately pack up and leave. But you had to be careful, because you might just be bringing it with you. Historians still argue whether the Great Sweating Sickness was a form of hantavirus, a rare but deadly virus transmitted by rodents. The symptoms are similar, with fever, chills and organ failure. Another theory is a form of influenza, or a previously unknown virus. The fact that it only occurred in England and disappeared for good in the 16th century remains a fascinating medical mystery. Its short, brutal life cycle and its inexplicable geographic specificity make it a unique chapter in the history of diseases. It's hard to imagine living in a time when a simple cold could be a death sentence, or when a sudden chill might be the start of a fatal journey. The Great Sweating Sickness was a chilling reminder of that reality. It was a disease that gave its victims no time to prepare, no time to say goodbye, and no chance to fight back. You would simply be overcome by a terrible feeling, and then, a few hours later, you would be gone, your body drenched in a cold, final sweat. It was a disease that defied logic and left behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. The unpredictability of the sweating sickness also led to some pretty desperate measures. People would try to sleep through the fever, a popular but misguided remedy. The idea was that if you could stay in bed, wrapped in warm blankets, and not be disturbed, the fever would eventually break and you would be safe. Unfortunately, this was also the time when the disease was at its most dangerous, and falling asleep could mean you were falling into a coma. It was a grim lottery, a gamble with your own life, and the odds were not in your favour. So as you settle into your bed, think about the people who lived in a world where a sudden chill could mean the beginning of the end. A world where you could be here one moment and gone the next. The Great Sweating Sickness was a ghostly affliction, appearing and disappearing like a phantom, leaving a trail of dead bodies and a whole lot of unanswered questions. It was a cruel reminder that some things, some diseases, just couldn't be reasoned with. They just were, and you were at their mercy. Let's move on from the fast, fleeting terror of the sweating sickness and delve into a different kind of horror. A disease that didn't just kill, but disfigured, leaving a permanent, cruel mark on its survivors. We're We're talking about smallpox, or as it was known then, the cruel pox. This was a viral menace that was a constant everyday threat. Unlike the plague, which came in waves, smallpox was endemic. It was always lurking, always waiting to strike. Imagine waking up with a high fever, a terrible headache, and a pain in your back that feels like you've been hit with a club. You might think it's just a bad case of the flu. But then, a few days later, a strange rash appears on your face, your hands and your feet. These little red spots would soon become blisters, and then, a few days after that, they would fill with a thick pus-like fluid. These were the characteristic pox, and they would cover your entire body. The blisters were incredibly itchy and painful, and they would leave you feeling as if you were wearing a suit of 1,000 burning coals. The real cruelty of smallpox was what happened next. If you survived, and about 20 to 30% of the people who contracted it didn't, the blisters would dry out and fall off, leaving behind deep, crater-like scars. You would be forever marked, your face a testament to the disease's brutal power. You would be known as a pockmarked person, and your physical appearance would be a constant reminder of your brush with death. This was a mainstream historical fact, a visual cue that was immediately recognisable in a world without photographs. You could tell, just by looking at someone, that they had survived smallpox. It was a visible badge of honour, or perhaps a permanent scarlet letter. Smallpox was a terrifyingly efficient killer, particularly among children. In some years it was estimated that it killed up to 90% of the children in a village, making it a childhood rite of passage that many did not survive. It was the great decimator of the young, leaving parents to mourn their children in a world where infant mortality was already brutally high. The disease also caused blindness in many of its victims, adding another layer of cruelty to an already horrific list of symptoms. The disease was so common that most people were either immune to it because they had survived it as a child, or they were dead. Now, let's talk about another affliction that was causing its own brand of havoc: syphilis. This was a newer disease, a sexually transmitted infection that was believed to have been brought back to Europe by Christopher Columbus's sailors from the Americas. It was a new and terrifying scourge, and it was so rampant that it was often called the Great Pox, to distinguish it from smallpox. The symptoms of syphilis were as gruesome as they were baffling. The disease would start with a sore, often on the genitals, which would disappear on its own after a few weeks. You might think you were in the clear, but then, a few weeks later, a rash would appear on your body, often on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Then the real damage would begin. Over the course of years, the disease would cause terrible sores on the body, a slow, methodical disfigurement. The skin would become scarred and pitted, and the nose could even collapse, a grim side effect of the disease eating away at the cartilage. But the real, long-term horror of syphilis was what it did to the mind and the nervous system. The disease in its final stages could cause madness, paralysis, and a terrible form of dementia. It was a cruel, mind-bending illness that could turn a healthy, vibrant person into a raving lunatic over the course of decades. It was a slow, agonizing descent into madness, and it was a public spectacle that terrified the people of the time. The treatments for syphilis were just as bad as the disease itself. The most popular cure was a concoction of mercury, which was believed to be a miracle cure. The patient would be given mercury pills or would have a mercury ointment rubbed on their body. The side effects were, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Mercury poisoning would cause a terrible metallic taste in the mouth, a loss of teeth, kidney failure, and a host of other horrible symptoms. You'd be drooling constantly, your teeth would be rotting in your gums, and you'd have terrible tremors. It was a grim choice: die from the disease or be slowly poisoned by the cure. Historians still argue whether the mercury treatments did more harm than good, but for the people of the time, it was their only hope. One of the more quirky tidbits from this era is the belief that syphilis could be cured by a specific type of wood called guaiacum. This wood, which came from the Caribbean, was believed to have miraculous healing powers. It was a very expensive commodity, and only the wealthiest people could afford the treatment. The patient would be locked in a room and forced to sweat profusely while drinking a tea made from the wood. It was an intense, uncomfortable, and of course, completely ineffective cure. It was a great example of a foreign exotic product being hailed as a miracle drug, a promise that it could do what no other cure could. The introduction of syphilis into Europe caused a widespread moral panic. It was seen as a punishment for a sinful lifestyle, and the people who contracted it were often ostracised. The disease was so new and so foreign that no one knew how to react to it. People would try to hide their symptoms, a futile attempt to avoid the public shame and social ruin that came with a syphilis diagnosis. It was a disease that preyed on shame and secrecy, a silent, creeping horror that was a complete mystery to the medical community. So as we settle down for the night, let's remember the smallpox survivor. Their face a mosaic of scars, a living testament to a disease that was a constant part of life. And let's remember the syphilis victim, slowly losing their mind and their body to a mysterious new illness. The Middle Ages was a world where a rash wasn't just a rash, and a fever wasn't just a fever. It was a world where a disease could strip you of your face, your mind, and your dignity, leaving you a living shadow of the person you once were. We've seen the swift horror of the plague and the slow-burning torment of smallpox and syphilis. Now let's turn our attention to the most common, and perhaps most misunderstood, of all medieval ailments, the fever. To us, a fever is a symptom, a sign that your body is fighting off an infection. But to the people of the Middle Ages, a fever was a disease in and of itself, a tangible imbalance that needed to be corrected. The entire medical worldview of the time was built on the theory of the four humours, and nowhere was this theory more evident than in the treatment of fever. Remember those four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. It was believed that each of these fluids was linked to one of the four elements: air, water, earth, fire, and that a person's health and even their personality were determined by the balance of these fluids. A fever, by this logic, was caused by an excess of blood, the hot humour. The logic, of course, was completely and utterly wrong, but it was the accepted scientific wisdom of the day, and it dictated every single medical treatment. Imagine you're a medieval physician. A patient comes to you with a raging fever. What's the first thing you do? You'd look at them and say, an excess of blood. We must get rid of the surplus. And so you'd reach for your lancet or a nice, plump leech. Bloodletting was the go-to remedy for virtually every ailment. The patient would be bled a little at a time, often from a vein in their arm or leg. The idea was to literally drain the bad blood out of the body, and with it, the fever. This was a mainstream historical fact, a ritual so ingrained in medical practice that it would continue for centuries. But it wasn't just bloodletting. The physician would also look at the colour of your urine, the texture of your stool, and the colour of your tongue to determine which humour was out of balance. They might recommend a special diet to cool you down, avoiding hot foods like meat and wine, and opting for cold foods like fruits and vegetables. You might be given a potion made from herbs believed to have a cooling property, like borage or violets. The entire treatment was a dance of balancing the humours, a complex and largely ineffective system of trial and error. This belief system extended beyond just fevers. If you were a sanguine person, full of blood, you were thought to be cheerful, optimistic, and prone to a happy-go-lucky attitude. If you were phlegmatic, full of phlegm, you were considered calm and a bit sluggish. The choleric person, with an excess of yellow bile, was irritable and hot-tempered. And the melancholic person, with too much black bile, was prone to sadness and depression. The theory of the humours was a complete personality profile, a medical and psychological explanation for every aspect of a person's being. One of the quirky tidbits from this era is the use of bizarre and often gross remedies based on the humour theory. For example, a fever patient might be given a concoction of chicken dung and other substances in the belief that it would draw out the hot humours. Or, in a particularly strange belief, some people thought that if you were suffering from a fever, you should eat the heart of a fox because the fox was a cunning and cool animal. The logic was, well, it was more of a magical incantation than a medical hypothesis. It was a hilarious and grim example of a society trying to make sense of a world they didn't understand. The problem with the four humours theory was that it was a closed system. It didn't allow for new ideas or outside influences. If a treatment failed, it wasn't the theory that was wrong. It was the patient. They weren't following the instructions correctly, or they were too sick to be saved. This intellectual stubbornness meant that medical progress was incredibly slow. For centuries, physicians would continue to bleed, purge, and poke at their patients, all in the name of a theory that was fundamentally flawed. Another thing to consider is the role of the barber surgeon. The physician, the man with the books and the university degree, would rarely, if ever, touch a patient. That was considered a dirty and undignified job. Instead, he would write a prescription and hand it over to the barber surgeon. The barber surgeon was the one who would perform the bloodletting, pull the teeth, and set the broken bones. He was the hands-on practitioner, and his knowledge was often passed down through an apprenticeship, not a formal education. The image of the barber pole with its red and white stripes is a direct callback to this era. The red stripe for blood and the white stripe for bandages. This was a mainstream historical fact, a fascinating look at the class divisions within the medical profession itself. Historians still argue whether the theory of the humours was a completely useless system or if it had some merit. Some scholars argue that while the underlying theory was wrong, the focus on diet, rest and a balanced lifestyle was not entirely misguided. They would say that the treatments, while based on a flawed premise, sometimes led to beneficial outcomes, and that it was a system that provided a framework for care in a world with no other options. Other historians argue that it was a medical dead end, a dogma that caused more harm than good and held back medical progress for 1,000 years. The fevers themselves were a constant source of agony. There was typhoid, which caused a terrible mind-bending fever and a distinctive rash. There was malaria, which came in a cycle of violent chills and a burning fever. And there were countless other fevers, each with its own quirks and symptoms, all of which were treated with the same basic, ineffective remedies. The fevers were a constant, a part of the background noise of life in the Middle Ages, a reminder that your body was a fragile, ticking time bomb. So as you get cosy, think about a world where a fever wasn't just a sign of sickness, but a fundamental imbalance of your entire being. A world where the cure for a fever was to drain your blood, a practice that would make you feel even weaker and sicker than you already were. The theory of the four humours was a testament to human ingenuity and intellectual hubris, a complex system built on a foundation of pure imagination. And for the poor medieval person, it was a system that offered hope, even as it failed to deliver a cure. We've waded through the blood and bile of the Middle Ages. Now let's talk about a disease that was truly a living hell, a sickness so terrifying that it was often mistaken for a demonic possession. I'm talking about ergotism, or as it was more popularly known, St. Anthony's fire. This was a sickness that didn't come from a virus or a bacteria, it came from the food itself. It was a silent, creeping poison hiding in the grain that fed an entire continent. The culprit was a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which would grow on rye and other grains in cool, damp conditions. The fungus produces a chemical that is a precursor to LSD, a potent hallucinogen, and a host of other chemicals that cause severe vasoconstriction, the tightening of blood vessels. When the contaminated grain was ground into flour and baked into bread, the poison was spread throughout the population. It was an invisible terror, and the people of the time had no idea that their daily bread was slowly poisoning them. The symptoms of ergotism were, in a word, nightmarish. There were two main types. The first was convulsive ergotism. Imagine, if you can, a terrible agonizing itch all over your body, as if 1,000 ants were crawling under your skin. This would be followed by violent, painful convulsions and muscle spasms. The patient would writhe in agony, their limbs contorting in grotesque shapes. They would have terrifying hallucinations and a burning feeling that would consume their body. This was not a quick death. This was a slow, agonizing descent into madness and physical torment. The victims would often bite their tongues and foam at the mouth, leading many people to believe that they were possessed by demons. The other type, and in some ways the more gruesome, was gangrenous ergotism. This was where the name St. Anthony's fire came from. The vasoconstriction caused by the poison would cut off the blood supply to the extremities, the fingers, toes, hands and feet. Your limbs would feel as if they were on fire, a searing, unbearable pain that was so intense you would scream in agony. As the blood supply was cut off, the tissue would die, turning black and shrivelling up. It was a slow, methodical march of death up your limbs. The affected part would eventually fall off on its own, a dry, mummified piece of flesh. People would lose fingers, toes, and sometimes entire arms and legs. It was a truly grotesque and horrifying sight, and it happened to people who were just trying to eat. The name St. Anthony's fire came from the fact that many of the victims would seek refuge at the shrines of St. Anthony the Great, who was the patron saint of people suffering from skin diseases and fire. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony would provide food that was free of the fungus, and many of the victims who went there would miraculously recover. Of course, the miracle was not a divine intervention, it was simply that they were no longer eating the poisoned bread. But to the people of the time, it was a miracle, a sign that faith could cure the uncurable. This was a mainstream historical fact, a poignant example of how a lack of scientific knowledge could lead to a reliance on faith. The fact that the disease came and went was baffling to the people of the time. One year a whole village might be afflicted, and the next they would be fine. Historians still argue whether the extreme weather conditions of the Middle Ages, with cold, damp summers, led to a greater prevalence of the fungus. The answer is likely yes, as it was a recurring problem during periods of widespread crop failure and famine. When food was scarce, people would eat whatever they could get their hands on, including the contaminated grain, making the poor and the hungry the most vulnerable. A quirky tidbit about ergotism is that it's believed to be the cause of some of the more famous witch trial frenzies, particularly the one in Salem, Massachusetts. The symptoms of convulsive ergotism, the muscle spasms, the hallucinations, the bizarre behaviour, are so similar to the behaviour of the people who are believed to be possessed by demons that some historians believe that the witch trials were, in fact, a mass outbreak of ergot poisoning. While this is still a fringe theory, it's a fascinating look at how a disease could be misinterpreted as a supernatural event, leading to widespread paranoia and death. The physicians of the time had no idea what to do about ergotism. They had no way of knowing that a fungus on the grain was the cause. They would try to treat the symptoms, but with no success. They would try to stop the convulsions with herbs and potions, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. The gangrene was particularly difficult to deal with, and the only cure was amputation, which was a dangerous and often fatal procedure in a world without anaesthesia or sterile surgical tools. So, as you get ready to turn off the lights, think about the people of the Middle Ages, sitting down to a meal of bread, their staple food, completely unaware that it was slowly poisoning them. A meal that could lead to a fire in their limbs, a slow, methodical march of death up their body, or a descent into a hallucinatory, convulsive hell. It was a disease that was a cruel, almost poetic irony, a poison in the very thing that was meant to sustain them. Let's continue our grim little journey. We've seen the great public spectacles of disease, but now we're going to talk about a quieter, yet no less brutal, killer. We're going to talk about dysentery, a disease that was a constant and ever-present threat in the medieval world. To put it simply, it's a gut-wrenching, stomach-churning and often fatal infection of the intestines. It was a disease that preyed on the most fundamental of human needs, the need to eat and drink, and in a world with no concept of germs or sanitation, it was a killer of terrifying efficiency. Imagine you're trudging through a crowded, filthy medieval town. The streets are a mix of mud, animal dung and human waste, and the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and general squalor. The water you drink comes from a local well, which unbeknownst to you is often contaminated by a nearby latrine pit. The food you eat is often spoiled or handled by people with unwashed hands. It's a perfect breeding ground for disease, and dysentery, a bacterial infection of the intestines, was a constant unwelcome guest. The first sign that something was wrong was a terrible agonizing cramp in your gut. It would feel like a hot knife twisting in your stomach. Then, the diarrhea would begin, but this wasn't just any diarrhea. This was a bloody, mucus-filled mess that would leave you feeling completely and utterly drained. You would be in constant pain, and you would be rushing to the privy, or the ditch, 12 times a day. The sheer volume of fluid loss would lead to severe dehydration, and the loss of essential salts and minerals would cause muscle cramps and a terrible, insatiable thirst. You would be a walking skeleton, a person slowly and methodically being drained of their life force. But the worst part of dysentery was the sheer indignity of it. It was a disease that took away your control, that turned a fundamental bodily function into a source of public shame and private agony. You would be completely and utterly incapacitated, unable to do anything but writhe in pain and run to the latrine. It was a disease that turned the human body against itself, a cruel, gut-wrenching reminder of your own fragility. Dysentery was so common that it was often called the bloody flux, and it was a leading cause of death, particularly in armies and during sieges. Armies would be decimated not by the sword but by a bacteria they couldn't see. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of a military camp were the perfect breeding ground for the disease, Latrines would be dug too close to the water supply, and the disease would spread like wildfire. A general might lose more men to dysentery than he would to the enemy, a truly frustrating and demoralising reality. This was a mainstream historical fact, a grim truth of military life for centuries. Even the most powerful armies in the world were often brought to their knees by a microscopic organism. The disease would also run rampant during times of famine, when people were forced to eat whatever they could find, often contaminated or spoiled food. The combination of malnutrition and disease was a deadly one, and it would decimate entire villages and towns. Now, let's talk about the cures for dysentery. They were, as you might expect, largely ineffective and often made things worse. The physicians, operating under the ever-present shadow of the theory of the four humours, believed that dysentery was caused by a build-up of black bile. The solution? To purge the body of the offending humour. This led to a series of remedies that were, in hindsight, a complete and utter disaster. A common remedy was a concoction of herbs and spices, some of which were ironically natural laxatives. You would be given a potion meant to purge the body, which of course would only make your symptoms worse. Another popular cure was a mixture of opium and other sedatives to try and stop the diarrhoea. While this might have given the patient a temporary respite, it did nothing to treat the underlying infection. The patient would feel better for a little while, but the disease would continue to ravage their insides, and they would eventually succumb to dehydration. One of the more quirky tidbits from this era is the use of strange and sometimes gross animal parts in the treatment of dysentery. A popular remedy was a concoction of boiled, ground-up deer antlers, believing that the mineral content would help. Another, even stranger, remedy was a mixture of roasted pig's stomach and other animal organs. The logic was that if it worked for a pig, it would work for a human. It's a hilarious, if grotesque, example of a desperate society trying to make sense of a disease they couldn't understand. The disease was so common and so difficult to treat that it gave rise to a whole new set of folk remedies. People would drink tea made from oak bark, believing that the tannins would help. They would eat strange concoctions of herbs and spices, and they would pray to their patron saints for a miracle. The helplessness of the medical community meant that people were often left to fend for themselves, relying on home remedies and good old-fashioned superstition. Historians still argue whether the high death toll from dysentery was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly unsanitary living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of clean drinking water, the widespread practice of throwing human waste into the streets, and the close proximity of people and animals created a perfect storm for the disease to flourish. The medical community's inability to understand or treat the disease only compounded the problem. So, as you get comfortable, think about the people of the Middle Ages, constantly at the mercy of a disease that was a daily threat. A disease that was a terrible, agonizing, and often fatal ordeal. The simple act of drinking water or eating a meal could be a death sentence, and the only cure was a series of ineffective remedies that often made things worse. Dysentery was a constant, gut-wrenching reminder of the fragile line between health and sickness, and of the simple yet profound importance of basic sanitation. We've been talking about diseases that are caused by invisible forces, but now we're going to talk about a disease that was believed to be cured by a visible and very powerful force, a king. We're going to talk about scrofula, or as it was more romantically known, the king's evil. This was a form of tuberculosis that affected the lymph nodes in the neck, causing large, unsightly and often painful swellings. And for centuries it was believed that the only cure was the touch of a divinely appointed monarch. Scrofula was a slow-moving, disfiguring illness. You would wake up one day with a small, hard lump on the side of your neck. It would be painless at first, but over the course of weeks and months it would grow and grow, often to the size of a plum. It would eventually become an open, weeping sore, and it would often leave a terrible, permanent scar. It was a disease that was a public mark of a person's suffering, a constant physical reminder of their illness. It was a terrifying reality for a person to live with, and it was a source of great shame. The cure for the king's evil was a ritual known as the royal touch. It was believed that a king, and later a queen, had a divine power to heal people with scrofula. You, the sick and desperate person, would travel to the royal court, and you would line up with hundreds of other people, all of them hoping for a miracle. When your turn came, the monarch would touch you, often on the affected area, and would then place a gold coin around your neck on a ribbon. It was a theatrical and emotional ritual, a public display of faith and royal power. This wasn't just a quirky folk tale, it was a widespread mainstream historical fact. English and French monarchs performed the royal touch for centuries, and it was a key part of their reign. The ritual was performed on a regular basis, sometimes in a public setting, and it was believed to be a sign that the king was truly chosen by God. For a sick and desperate person, the royal touch was a source of profound hope. The idea that a single person, a monarch, could heal you with a single touch was a powerful and compelling idea in a world with no effective medical treatments. But did it work? Well, historians still argue whether the royal touch had any effect at all. Some scholars argue that it was a complete placebo, a powerful psychological ritual that made people feel better, even if it didn't cure the underlying disease. The disease itself, scrofula, was a slow-moving illness that would often go into remission on its own, so it was easy for people to believe that the royal touch had cured them. Other historians argue that the ritual was a clever bit of political theatre, a way for the monarch to reinforce their divine right to rule and to connect with their subjects on a personal and emotional level. The sight of a king or a queen touching a sick and desperate person was a powerful symbol of their compassion and their power. A quirky tidbit from this era is that the practice of the royal touch was so popular that it was even adopted by the British government for a while. After the practice was officially abandoned, the government would still give out a small gold coin to people who had scrofula, believing that it would help them. It was a bizarre and humorous example of a political tradition outliving its religious and medical purpose. The reality, of course, was that scrofula was a form of tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that could only be cured with a long course of antibiotics, something that didn't exist for another 500 years. The royal touch was a beautiful and poignant ritual, but it was not a medical cure. For the people who went through the ritual, it was a source of hope, a moment of connection with their monarch, and a powerful symbol of their faith. But for the disease itself, it did nothing. The large weeping sores would continue to fester, and the person would continue to suffer. The fact that the disease was so common and so visible meant that it was a constant part of life. You would see people with the telltale lumps on their necks, and you would know that they were suffering from the king's evil. The disease was a reminder of the fragility of the human body and of the powerlessness of the medical community. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the only thing a person could do was to put their faith in a higher power, or in this case, in a divinely appointed monarch. So as you turn off the lights, think about the people who, in their desperation, would travel for miles to get a single touch from their king. A touch that offered hope but no cure. The king's evil was a testament to the power of belief and the triumph of the human spirit in the face of an incurable disease. It was a beautiful, but ultimately tragic story of a society that believed in magic more than it believed in science. We've explored the great disfigurers and the gut-wrenching diseases, but now we'll talk about a quieter kind of suffering, a slow, methodical bending of the human form. We're going to talk about rickets, a disease that turned a child's bones into a soft, pliable substance, and left them with a body that was forever a testament to their illness. Rickets was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that was a cruel, almost poetic irony, in a world that was so focused on building things out of stone and wood. Imagine you're a child growing up in a crowded, dark medieval city. The sun, a source of life-giving vitamin D, is a rare visitor, blocked by the tall buildings and the constant smog from the hearth fires. You're living on a diet that consists of mostly gruel, bread, and other grain-based foods. There's no milk, no fish, no eggs, no anything with any real nutritional value. You're a little pale, maybe a little weak, and your parents just think you're a sickly child. But then, as you get older, your legs start to bend. Your bones, which should be hard and strong, are instead soft and pliable. Your legs bow out, your spine curves, and your chest sinks in. You're not just a little weak, you're a child whose very skeleton is failing. Rickets, as we know today, is caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin D, calcium and phosphate. Without these essential nutrients, the body can't properly mineralize the bones, leaving them soft and weak. In the Middle Ages, with poor nutrition and a lack of sunlight, it was a tragically common illness. It wasn't just a physical affliction, it was a permanent, visible reminder of your poverty and your suffering. You would be a rickety person, your body a testament to a life lived in the shadows, and a diet that was lacking in the most fundamental of nutrients. The physical deformities were, to put it mildly, grotesque. The bowed legs were the most common symptom, but it was just the beginning. The spine could curve into a hunchback, a terrible and often permanent disability. The chest could sink in, giving a person a pigeon-breasted appearance. The skull could become strangely shaped, and the pelvis could become narrow and misshapen, making childbirth a dangerous and often fatal ordeal for a woman. It was a disease that left its victims with a body that was a cruel parody of the human form. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused rickets. They didn't know about vitamins or minerals. They thought it was a punishment from God or a congenital defect. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would try to straighten the bones with braces and casts, which were agonizingly uncomfortable and did nothing to treat the underlying cause. They would try to give the patient bizarre concoctions of herbs and other substances, but none of it worked. The only real cure was to change the diet and to get some sunlight, but in a world where food was scarce and people lived in dark, crowded conditions, that was often impossible. A quirky tidbit about rickets is the fact that it was not just a disease of the poor. The wealthy, who lived in grand houses with little access to the outdoors, were also susceptible. They would often be swaddled in heavy clothing and kept inside, away from the sun, believing that a pale complexion was a sign of nobility. This led to a strange and ironic reality where the very thing that was meant to protect them, their wealth and their status, was in fact making them more susceptible to the disease. The disease was so common that it was a constant and visible part of the medieval landscape. You would see children with bowed legs and hunched backs, and you would just think that that was how some people were. It was a testament to the sheer brutality of a world without modern medicine and without a basic understanding of nutrition. It was a cruel and silent suffering, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was a constant physical reminder of your pain. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of rickets was due to the lack of sunlight or the lack of nutrition. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The poor diet and the dark, crowded living conditions created a perfect storm for the disease to flourish. The lack of knowledge about vitamins and minerals meant that people were dying, or being permanently deformed, from a disease that could have been prevented with a little bit of food and a little bit of sunlight. So as you get comfortable, think about the children of the Middle Ages, their bones slowly and methodically bending, their bodies becoming a cruel physical testament to their suffering. Rickets was a disease that was a quiet, unassuming horror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on building things out of stone and wood. We've moved through the visible deformities of rickets, and now we will encounter a disease that was just as insidious, but far more beautiful, at least to the poets and artists of the time. We're talking about tuberculosis, or as it was more romantically known, consumption. This was a slow, methodical killer, a disease that didn't just ravage the body, but also, in a strange, cruel way, seemed to make its victims more beautiful, more ethereal. It was a true ticking time bomb, a disease that was a constant part of life, and one that was almost always fatal. Imagine you're a young, vibrant person in the Middle Ages. You're full of life, full of energy. But then one day, you get a small nagging cough. You think nothing of it at first. But then the cough gets worse. You start to feel tired, weak. You lose your appetite. You start to lose weight. And you feel as if you're slowly and methodically being consumed from the inside out. Your cheeks become flushed. Your eyes become bright. And your skin becomes a pale, translucent white. You look, in a strange, terrible way, more beautiful than you've ever looked before. This was the deceptive beauty of consumption. Tuberculosis, as we know it today, is a bacterial infection of the lungs, and it was a leading cause of death for centuries. It would spread from person to person through the air, through a cough or a sneeze. The bacteria would slowly and methodically eat away at your lungs, and you would slowly and methodically waste away. The weight loss was so extreme that the person would look like a skeleton, a living ghost of their former self. The cough would be so bad that you would eventually cough up blood, a grim and terrifying sight that signalled the end was near. The disease was so common that it was a constant part of a life. Everyone knew someone who had consumption. It was a family curse, a disease that seemed to follow people from generation to generation. It was the great equalizer, striking down the rich and the poor, the old and the young. It was a disease that was a constant source of fear, a silent, creeping terror that was always present. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused it. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of the humours, a bad diet, or a weak constitution. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would recommend fresh air and a change of scenery. They would try to give the patient bizarre concoctions of herbs and other substances, but nothing worked. The only real cure was a long, slow period of rest and a change of diet. But in a world where people had to work to survive, that was often impossible. A quirky tidbit about tuberculosis is the fact that it was considered, in a strange way, a romantic disease. The paleness, the bright eyes, the fragile, ethereal look of the victim was considered to be a sign of a heightened sensibility, a sign of a person who was too good for this world. Poets and artists would write about the pale young things who were slowly wasting away, and the disease became a symbol of a tragic, beautiful death. It's a testament to the strange and twisted way that a society can romanticize a terrible illness. Historians still argue whether the high death toll from tuberculosis was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly unsanitary living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The crowded, dark and damp living conditions of the Middle Ages were a perfect breeding ground for the disease. The lack of knowledge about how it spread meant that people were constantly infecting each other, and the cycle of death would continue for centuries. The disease was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your health was a fragile thing, and that a small nagging cough could be the beginning of the end. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was a constant physical reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. So as you get comfortable, think about the people of the Middle Ages, their bodies slowly and methodically being consumed by a disease that was a constant ticking time bomb. Tuberculosis was a disease that was a quiet, unassuming horror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. We've seen diseases that prey on the poor and the weak. Now let's turn our attention to an ailment that was, in many ways, a status symbol. We're going to talk about gout, a painful joint disease that was often called the rich man's disease, or the disease of kings. It was a cruel irony. The very things that were a sign of wealth, a diet rich in meat and wine and a life of leisure, were the very things that would bring a person to their knees in agony. Imagine you're a wealthy nobleman in the Middle Ages. You're feasting on roasted boar, a leg of lamb, and washing it all down with a jug of the finest wine. You're living a life of luxury and excess, a life that a peasant could only dream of. But then, in the middle of the night, you wake up with an excruciating pain in your big toe. It feels as if a hot iron is being pressed into your joint. The pain is so intense that you can't even bear the weight of a sheet on your foot. Your toe is red, swollen, and feels as if it's on fire. This, my friend, is your first encounter with a gout attack. Gout, as we know today, is a form of arthritis caused by a buildup of uric acid in the body. The uric acid forms sharp, needle-like crystals that deposit in the joints, particularly the big toe, causing a terrible, agonizing pain. It was a disease that was a direct result of a person's diet. The rich, who could afford to eat large quantities of red meat and drink alcohol, were particularly susceptible. The poor, who lived on a diet of gruel and bread, were largely immune. It was a strange and cruel irony, a disease that was a testament to a person's wealth and a symbol of their gluttony. The gout attacks would come in waves. You would have a terrible attack, and then, after a few weeks, the pain would subside. You would feel fine for a while, and then, without warning, the pain would return with a vengeance. Over time, the constant inflammation would cause permanent damage to the joints, leaving a person with a stiff, swollen and disfigured body. The hands, feet and knees could all be affected, leaving a person with a body that was a testament to their illness. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused gout. They didn't know about uric acid or crystals. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of the humours, a bad diet, or a weak constitution. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would try to bleed the person, believing that it would get rid of the bad humours, or they would try to give the person a special diet, but they didn't know what to avoid. The only real cure was to change your lifestyle, to stop eating the things that were causing the problem. But in a world where a rich diet was a sign of your status, that was often impossible. A quirky tidbit about gout is the fact that it was not just a physical disease, it was a cultural one. The person who had gout was often seen as a person of good breeding, a person who had lived a life of leisure and luxury. It was a strange, almost humorous sign of your status. The person who had gout would often be seen as a person of wit and humour, a person who had lived a full and rich life. It was a strange and twisted way that a society could romanticise a terrible illness. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of gout among the elite was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly rich and unhealthy lifestyle of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of knowledge about what caused the disease meant that people were dying or being permanently deformed from a disease that could have been prevented with a little bit of diet and exercise. The rich lifestyle of the elite, with its emphasis on excess and indulgence, was the perfect storm for the disease to flourish. The disease was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your health was a fragile thing and that a single meal could be the beginning of a life of pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. We've seen how disease stalked the adults of the Middle Ages, but now we must turn our attention to the most vulnerable among them, the children. In a world with no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no understanding of sanitation, childhood was a minefield of deadly diseases. The odds were stacked against you from the very moment you were born, and many children did not live to see their first birthday. The diseases they faced were a constant, silent terror, and for many the cause was not an invisible virus, but a simple lack of food. Imagine you're a child in a medieval village. Your diet consists of a thin gruel, a piece of bread, and if you're lucky, a few vegetables. Meat, milk, and eggs are rare luxuries, and as a result your body is slowly and methodically being starved of the nutrients it needs to grow. You're not just a little hungry, you're a child whose very body is failing. This, my friend, is your first encounter with malnutrition, and it was a silent and often fatal killer. The lack of essential nutrients made children susceptible to a host of diseases. The lack of vitamin C, which is essential for a healthy immune system, led to scurvy. The gums would bleed, the teeth would fall out, and the body would be covered in strange purple blotches. The lack of iron led to anemia, a condition that left a child pale, weak, and constantly tired. The lack of protein led to kwashiorkor, a disease that caused a child's stomach to swell with fluid, giving them a bloated, pregnant appearance. It was a cruel and ironic reality, a disease that made a child look full when in fact they were slowly and methodically starving to death. But it wasn't just malnutrition. Children were also susceptible to a host of other diseases. There was measles, a disease that was and still is highly contagious. It would cause a high fever and a terrible rash, and in a world with no effective treatments, it was a leading cause of death. There was whooping cough, a disease that caused a terrible, uncontrollable cough that would leave a child gasping for air. The cough was so severe that it would often cause a child to vomit, and in some cases it would lead to brain damage or death. The lack of understanding about contagion meant that a single sick child could infect an entire village. The parents, who had no idea how the disease was spreading, would try to care for their child, and in doing so they would often infect themselves and their other children. It was a vicious cycle of death and disease, a constant silent terror that was a part of everyday life. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused these diseases. They didn't know about viruses or bacteria. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of the humours, a bad diet, or a weak constitution. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would try to give the child bizarre concoctions of herbs and other substances, but none of it worked. The only real cure was a long, slow period of rest and a change of diet. But in a world where food was scarce, that was often impossible. A quirky tidbit about childhood diseases is the fact that they were often seen as a normal and expected part of life. The high infant mortality rate meant that parents were often reluctant to form a deep attachment to their children, for fear that they would lose them. It was a cruel and ironic reality, a society that had to protect itself from the emotional pain of losing a child by not getting too attached in the first place. Historians still argue whether the high death toll from childhood diseases was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly unsanitary living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of clean drinking water, the widespread practice of throwing human waste into the streets, and the close proximity of people and animals created a perfect storm for the disease to flourish. The medical community's inability to understand or treat the disease only compounded the problem. So, as you get comfortable, think about the children of the Middle Ages, their bodies slowly and methodically being starved of the nutrients they needed to grow, and their lives constantly at risk from a host of deadly diseases. Childhood was not a time of innocence and play. It was a time of suffering and a constant silent struggle for survival. It was a cruel and ironic reality, a society that had to protect itself from the emotional pain of losing a child by not getting too attached in the first place. We have looked at the physical ailments that ravaged the medieval body. Now, we're going to delve into a different kind of illness, one that tormented the mind and the spirit. We're going to talk about mental afflictions, and how in a world with no concept of psychology or psychiatry, these illnesses were often misinterpreted as a divine punishment, a moral failing, or, most terrifying of all, demonic possession. Imagine you're a person in the Middle Ages, and you're suffering from what we would today call depression. You feel a terrible sadness, a profound sense of hopelessness. You have no energy, no appetite. You withdraw from your friends and family. You're not just a little sad, you're a person whose very soul feels as if it's being crushed. Your family, your friends, and your community have no concept of a mental illness. They see your sadness, your withdrawal, and they look for an explanation. The most common and terrifying explanation, of course, is that you are possessed by a demon. The person suffering from a mental illness would be taken to a priest or a religious leader, who would often recommend a series of rituals and prayers to drive the demon out. The person might be exorcised, a terrifying and often physically violent ritual that was meant to force the demon to leave the body. The person might be taken to a church, and they would be forced to fast, to pray, and to confess their sins, all in the hope that it would make the demon leave. The person who was suffering from a mental illness was not seen as a person who was sick. They were seen as a person who was a victim of a spiritual attack. But it wasn't just demonic possession. Mental illness was also seen as a punishment from God for a person's sins. If you were suffering from a mental illness, it was believed that you had done something wrong, that you had offended God, and that your suffering was a divine punishment. You were not just sick, you were a moral failure. This belief led to a profound sense of shame and guilt, a feeling that your suffering was your own fault and that you deserved it. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused mental illness. They didn't know about brain chemistry or neurotransmitters. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of the humours, a bad diet, or a weak constitution. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would try to bleed the person, believing that it would get rid of the bad humours. They would try to give the person a special diet, but none of it worked. The only real cure was a long, slow period of rest and a change of scenery. But in a world where mental illness was a source of profound shame and fear, that was often impossible. A quirky tidbit about mental illness in the Middle Ages is the fact that some people believed that a person who was suffering from a mental illness could be cured by a specific ritual. The person would be taken to a religious shrine, and they would be forced to sleep there for a night, in the hope that the saint would cure them in their sleep. It was a bizarre and humorous example of a desperate society trying to make sense of a disease they couldn't understand. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of mental illness was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly stressful living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The constant fear of disease, the constant struggle for survival, and the lack of a proper diet and rest created a perfect storm for mental illness to flourish. The lack of knowledge about how to treat it, and the widespread belief that it was a divine punishment, only compounded the problem. The person who was suffering from a mental illness was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your mind was a fragile thing, and that a small nagging feeling could be the beginning of a life of shame and fear. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a mind that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. Let's continue our tour of medieval maladies. We've talked about the diseases that ravage the body and the mind, but now we're going to talk about a smaller, yet no less agonizing source of suffering: the toothache. In a world with no dentists, no painkillers, and no understanding of dental hygiene, a toothache wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a source of profound and debilitating pain. For many, the only solution was to live with the torment, or to seek out the local barber surgeon, a man with a pair of pliers and a strong arm. Imagine you're a person in the Middle Ages. You're eating a piece of bread, and you feel a sharp, stabbing pain in your jaw. The pain starts as a dull throb, but over the course of the day it becomes a searing, unbearable agony that radiates up to your ear and your temple. You can't sleep, you can't eat, you can't think of anything but the pain. Your face swells, your jaw throbs, and you feel as if a tiny invisible worm is slowly and methodically drilling into your tooth. This, my friend, is your first encounter with a medieval toothache, and it was a torment that could last for days, weeks, or even months. The prevailing belief, a quirky tidbit from the time, was that a toothache was caused by a toothworm. It was a tiny, invisible worm that would burrow into your tooth and gnaw away at the root, causing the pain. The only way to get rid of it, of course, was to get rid of the worm. The treatments for the toothache were, as you might expect, a series of bizarre and often ineffective rituals. People would try to smoke the worm out with a mixture of herbs and spices. They would try to kill the worm with a concoction of strange potions and ointments. They would even try to trap the worm by putting a small amount of oil on a piece of wool and sticking it in the hole in their tooth. The logic was, of course, completely and utterly wrong, but it was the accepted scientific wisdom of the day. The reality, as we know today, was that the toothache was caused by a dental abscess, a bacterial infection that would cause a terrible, agonizing pain. The bacteria would eat away at the tooth, and in a world with no dental hygiene, it was a constant and ever-present threat. The only real solution was to pull the tooth, a procedure that was as brutal as it was painful. The barber surgeon, the man with the pliers, would grab your tooth and pull it out with a single agonizing tug. There was no anesthesia, no painkillers, and no concept of sanitation. The pain was so intense that many people would choose to live with the toothache rather than endure the agonizing procedure of having it pulled. The tools of the trade were, to put it mildly, rudimentary. The barber surgeon would have a pair of pliers, a hammer, and a few other simple tools. The procedure was a brutal and bloody affair, and it would often lead to a terrible infection. The barber surgeon, who was also the village barber, would often perform the procedure on a customer who was already in his chair. A grim and humorous image of a man who was as likely to give you a haircut as he was to pull your tooth. This was a mainstream historical fact, a fascinating look at the class divisions within the medical profession itself. The person who had a terrible toothache was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your health was a fragile thing, and that a single piece of food could be the beginning of a life of pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a mouth that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of dental problems was due to the lack of dental hygiene or the lack of modern dentistry. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of knowledge about how to care for your teeth and the lack of a proper diet created a perfect storm for dental problems to flourish. The medical community's inability to understand or treat the problem only compounded the problem. So as you get comfortable, think about the people of the Middle Ages, their mouths slowly and methodically being consumed by a disease that was a constant ticking time bomb. The toothache was a disease that was a quiet, unassuming horror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a mouth that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. We've talked about the external sources of pain, but now we're going to delve into a different kind of horror, one that was contained within the body itself. We're going to talk about gallstones and other stones in the body, which were a source of profound and debilitating pain. In a world with no ultrasound, no painkillers, and no understanding of anatomy, a stone in the body was a source of profound and agonizing pain. Imagine you're a person in the Middle Ages. You're eating a rich, fatty meal, and you feel a terrible, cramping pain in your stomach. The pain is so intense that you can't even stand up straight. You feel a terrible nausea, and you start to vomit. The pain is so severe that you can't even think straight. You feel as if a tiny invisible rock is slowly and methodically tearing your insides apart. This, my friend, is your first encounter with a gallstone attack, and it was a torment that could last for hours, days, or even weeks. The gallstone, as we know today, is a small, hard deposit that forms in the gallbladder, a small organ that helps with digestion. The gallstones would often get stuck in the ducts, causing a terrible, agonizing pain. The medical community, of course, had no idea what caused them. They didn't know about cholesterol or a bad diet. They thought it was caused by an imbalance of the humours, a bad diet, or a weak constitution. The treatments were, as you might expect, completely and utterly ineffective. They would try to give the person a special diet, but they didn't know what to avoid. The only real cure was to wait for the stone to pass, a process that was as agonising as it was painful. But it wasn't just gallstones. The medieval person was also susceptible to bladder stones and kidney stones, which were a source of profound and debilitating pain. The kidney stone, which is a small, hard deposit that forms in the kidney, would often travel down the ureter, a narrow tube that connects the kidney to the bladder. The pain was so intense that it would cause a person to writhe in agony. The only real solution was to live with the pain, or to seek out the local stonecutter, a man who would, with a series of simple tools, try to cut the stone out of the person's body. The stonecutter, a fringe historical tidbit, was a specialised practitioner, a man who, with a series of simple tools, would try to cut the stone out of the person's body. The procedure, which was done without anaesthesia or sanitation, was as brutal as it was bloody. The stonecutter would make a small incision in the person's body, and with a series of simple tools he would try to cut the stone out. The procedure was a brutal and bloody affair, and it would often lead to a terrible infection. The pain was so intense that many people would choose to live with the stone rather than endure the agonising procedure of having it cut out. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of stones was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly unsanitary living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of knowledge about how to care for your body and the lack of a proper diet created a perfect storm for stones to flourish. The medical community's inability to understand or treat the problem only compounded the problem. The person who had a terrible stone was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your health was a fragile thing and that a single piece of food could be the beginning of a life of pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly, but instead left you with a body that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. Let's continue our journey into the world of medieval medicine, where a simple cut could be a death sentence and the most common cure was to drain a person's life force. We're going to talk about bloodletting and other unsanitary surgical procedures, and how these practices, which were meant to heal, often did more harm than good. In a world with no concept of germs, a simple procedure could lead to a terrible infection, and the most common surgical tool was a knife that was as likely to be used for a meal as it was for a surgery. Imagine you're a person in the Middle Ages, you're feeling a little under the weather, a little tired, a little weak. You go to see a physician, a learned man in a long robe, and he tells you that you have an imbalance of your humours. The solution, he says, is to get rid of the bad blood. You're then taken to a barber surgeon, a man with a sharp knife and a strong arm. He makes a small incision in your arm or your leg, and he lets the blood flow into a bowl. The blood is dark and thick, and you feel a little dizzy, but you're told that it's a good sign, a sign that the bad humours are leaving your body. You're told that you'll feel better in a few days, but in reality, you feel even weaker and sicker than you did before. Bloodletting was a mainstream historical fact, a ritual so ingrained in medical practice that it was used for everything from a fever to a headache to a broken bone. The belief was that the body was full of bad blood, and that the only way to get rid of it was to let it out. The barber surgeon, the man with the knife, was the one who would perform the procedure, and he would do it with a series of simple tools. There was no concept of sanitation, no idea that a dirty knife or a contaminated bowl could lead to a terrible infection. The procedure was a brutal and bloody affair, and it would often lead to a terrible infection, a fever, and in many cases death. But it wasn't just bloodletting. The medieval surgeon was also called upon to perform a host of other procedures, from setting a broken bone to amputating a gangrenous limb. The tools of the trade were, to put it mildly, rudimentary. The surgeon would have a knife, a saw, a few other simple tools, and a strong arm. The procedure was done without anaesthesia, so the patient would be screaming in agony. The surgeon would often have to work quickly, and the only way to stop the bleeding was with a hot iron, a brutal and bloody affair. The most terrifying part of medieval surgery was the lack of sanitation. The surgeon's hands, his tools, and the operating room were all covered in dirt and grime. The surgeon had no idea that a small invisible organism could cause a terrible infection. The wound would often become infected, and the person would get a fever, and in many cases they would die. The pain was so intense that many people would choose to live with a broken bone or a gangrenous limb, rather than endure the agonizing procedure of having it fixed. A quirky tidbit about medieval surgery is the fact that some surgeons would perform a procedure called a trepanning, a brutal procedure where they would drill a hole in the person's skull to release the demons that were causing a mental illness or a terrible headache. The procedure was as brutal as it was bloody, and it would often lead to a terrible infection or death. The person who survived the procedure was often a living ghost of their former self, a person who had been through a terrible and agonizing ordeal. It was a bizarre and humorous example of a desperate society trying to make sense of a disease they couldn't understand. Historians still argue whether the high death toll from medieval surgery was due to the lack of medical knowledge or the incredibly unsanitary living conditions of the time. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The lack of knowledge about how to care for your body and the lack of a proper diet created a perfect storm for infection to flourish. The medical community's inability to understand or treat the problem only compounded the problem. The person who had a terrible fever or a broken bone was a constant ticking time bomb, a reminder that your health was a fragile thing and that a single piece of bad luck could be the beginning of a life of pain. It was a silent, creeping terror, a disease that didn't kill you quickly but instead left you with a body that was forever a reminder of your pain. It was a disease that was a cruel and ironic reality in a world that was so focused on living. We've reached the end of our journey, a grim tour through the diseases that haunted the medieval world. We started with the terrifying, swift arrival of the Black Death, and now we must return to it, to understand its lasting legacy, its echoes that would be felt for centuries, and how it, in a strange way, paved the way for modern medicine. The plague wasn't just a disease, it was an apocalyptic event that changed the course of history. The plague's first and most obvious legacy was its massive death toll. It's estimated that it killed a third of Europe's population, a loss of life so profound that it's almost impossible to comprehend. This mass death had a profound and lasting impact on society. The feudal system, which was based on a hierarchy of lords and peasants, was thrown into chaos. This sudden lack of labour meant that the peasants, who had once been tied to the land, were now in a position to demand higher wages and more rights. The power dynamic shifted, and the peasants, for the first time, had a voice. This was a mainstream historical fact, a profound and lasting legacy of the plague. The plague also had a profound impact on religion and faith. For centuries, the church had been the centre of life, a source of comfort and salvation. But when the plague struck, and the prayers and rituals failed to stop the death, many people began to lose their faith. They saw their priests dying, they saw the saints failing to intercede, and they began to question the very foundation of their beliefs. This led to a rise in new, more radical religious movements, and a questioning of the church's authority. The plague was a spiritual crisis as much as it was a physical one. The plague also had a lasting impact on medicine. The failure of the theory of the four humours to stop the plague was a wake-up call for the medical community. The old ways of thinking were no longer working, and a new way of thinking was needed. This led to a new emphasis on a more empirical approach to medicine, a focus on observation and experimentation. The plague was a catalyst for change, a grim reminder that the old ways of thinking were no longer enough. This led to the development of new medical theories, new surgical techniques, and a new understanding of the human body. A quirky tidbit about the plague's legacy is the fact that the children's nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is believed to be a reference to the plague. Ring Around the Rosie is believed to be a reference to the red circular rash that was a symptom of the disease. A pocket full of posies is a reference to the belief that a fragrant herb would ward off the disease. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down is a reference to the death and the mass burials. While this is a fringe theory, it's a fascinating and grim example of how a terrible illness can be turned into a piece of popular culture. Historians still argue whether the plague was the single greatest catalyst for change in the Middle Ages, or if it was simply a part of a larger, more complex set of changes. The answer, of course, is a bit of both. The plague was a powerful and transformative event, but it was also a part of a larger, more complex set of changes that were already underway. The plague accelerated these changes, but it did not create them. The plague's echoes are still with us today. The concept of quarantine, the idea of wearing a mask, the fear of an invisible, deadly virus, all of these things are a direct legacy of the Black Death. The plague was a lesson in humility, a reminder that we are not the masters of our own destiny, and that a single, microscopic organism can bring a society to its knees. The journey has been long and dark, a tour through a world that was a constant ticking time bomb of disease. But now it's time to let it go. The darkness, the pain, the fear. It's all a part of history now, a part of the past. As you fade into sleep, know that you are safe. Your bed is warm, your home is clean, and the invisible monsters of the past are nothing but a memory. The fear and the suffering are a part of a world that no longer exists, a world that we have left behind. Slowly, as the final words are spoken, let the images of the medieval world fade away. The plague doctor's mask, the leper's bell, the hunched back of the rickets victim. Let them all become a whisper, a distant echo in the night. The scent of the burning herbs, the sound of the cough, the feel of the cold, clammy sweat. Let them all dissolve into the silence. Your world is safe now. The monsters are gone. You are warm, you are safe, and you are here. The stories are over. The journey is done. The only thing left to do is to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the gentle hum of the fan lull you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.